Good morning, everyone. It's nice to be back worshipping with you again. And thank you, David, for your welcome. All I can say is you guys are tigers for punishment to keep asking me back. I feel honoured, but I also feel it's a great responsibility to lead out in our worship time this morning. Last year, I had the opportunity to tick off one of the lists of my bucket lists. And I joined a group from Western Australia and we went to the Holy Lands. Whether I'll be able to tick off another one of my bucket lists is a bit problematical because you probably see I'm limping a little bit, and these trips do involve a lot of walking. Some days on this trip last year I was managing around about 23,000 steps, which I couldn't do today. But it was very inspirational for me. And of course the other thing is whether with COVID-19, when will we be able to do another overseas trip? I was actually planning a follow-up one to this one and going on Journeys of Paul. And that was supposed to have been finishing on the 1st of July. It's been postponed. But what I found very inspirational was in this post-Christian era where Christianity is very much dismissed today, and I found it inspirational to actually walk where we know that Jesus actually walked. Some of the places we can't precisely pinpoint. We know the general area, but some sites, thanks to modern archaeology, and specifically because some of the areas that weren't available now are now available under Israeli occupation, and some of these sites have been excavated. In fact, what they've been finding with archaeology, many people who question various places and that in the Bible have been discovered and proven, so much so now that many archaeologists go and look at the Bible to try and establish where they should start digging and looking. A lot of the sites, not all of them, are traditional sites. And these came about because really responsible was Constantine, the Roman emperor, who built a palace in Byzantium, or if you like, Byzantium. I prefer Byzantium. And he built a palace there, and surprise, surprise, he renamed the place Constantinople. And as you know, that is today modern Istanbul. He wasn't initially a Christian. He actually became converted and was baptised on his deathbed. But he gave his mother, Helena, or now Saint Helena, free access to the treasury funds to go down to the Holy Land and establish where the various sites were and to get relics. And it was in the years 326 to 328 that she went to Palestine, and she built 2 churches on traditional sites. One was the I think it was where the Nativity, and the other one was the Ascension. And following on that, Constantine actually then went and built some other churches on places that she had identified. Now, much of the land in Israel in Christ's time is no longer under Jewish control until the Yom Kippur War in 1973, the 6-day Yom Kippur War, where Israel annexed some of the areas, for instance, the West Bank, which had been under Jordanian control. So I thought what we should do now is just have a look. And first of all, we look at Palestine as it was in Israel, in the time of Israel, or the time of Jesus, and then the modern Israel. So up here you can see the Sea of Galilee, and down here Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Bethany, Jericho, etc. Now today, initially, excuse me, this is the area that Israel occupied. And then after the Yom Kippur War, they annexed the West Bank and Gaza and the Golan Heights. So although these are still governed by the Palestinians, they're under the control of the Israelis. I think we should start our journey where it all began. And where was that? Nazareth, wasn't it? It was Nazareth. So today, it has a population around 78,000, mostly Arab Palestinian. And in Christ's time, of course, it was Jewish. And the population they estimate in those days was about 150. Now, we know that the angel appeared to Mary there in Nazareth and told her that she was going to give birth to the Messiah. We read about that in Luke chapter 1, 26 to 30. Now, we don't know exactly where that message came in Nazareth. There is a traditional site. So Gabriel appears to Mary, and that she was going to be the mother of the Son of the Most High God. And so there's a traditional site, the Church of the Annunciation, which is supposed to be the site of Mary's home. And there is a picture of it. Now, we have no proof of that at all. And as you know, tradition also says that the mother of Mary was Saint Anne. We don't know that. It's not recorded in the Bible. But this is the traditional site of where the angel appeared to Mary. And of course, as we all know, Caesar ordered everyone to go to their birthplace and to register. And so we know that Joseph had to go to Bethlehem to register. Nazareth to Bethlehem on the present day route, 150 kilometres or 170 kilometres. Or as the crow flies, it's 100 kilometres. So it's quite a distance. Now, Constantine, as I said, ordered building on some of these sites, and one of these traditional sites is this one here. On my right is an Armenian monastery, and over here is the Church of the Nativity. It's actually under the control of three groups of people: the Greek Orthodox, the Armenians, and the Roman Catholic and Protestants. This is inside the Church of the Nativity. This was rebuilt after a fire, but we can still see some of they've opened up, and you can see some of the original tiles of the church that was built in 330 AD on the command of Constantine. Now, we have a picture, don't we, of Christ being born in a manger. The evidence doesn't suggest that. And this is where Christ was born, in a grotto, or series of grottos underneath this church. We didn't go down because it was a queue a mile long but here you can see people coming up from out of the grotto. In one of the neighbouring grottos, excuse me, so basically this is rebuilt in 529 and has been remoulded subsequently. Excuse me. Also in another grotto underneath, I can't remember the guy's name, but he translated the Vulgate version of the Bible. So what do you think, what do they think that it was actually like in the, excuse me, in where Jesus was born? And this is an example of one of the grottos, and this is the traditional grotto where they believe that Jesus was actually born. It's a little bit different to what we imagine. Thank you very much. That might help me. Thank you. Sorry about that. Now this, we think of Jesus being born in an inn. There's actually no evidence in the records, not in the Bible, but in records, that there was an inn, in fact, in Bethlehem. Bethlehem was a very small population, and in those days, most houses would have a grotto attached to the dwelling, and it was an integral part of the actual dwelling. The cattle and cooking would be done in the grotto, and the people lived in the house. And the tradition always was that when a person was going to give birth, they'd give birth in the house. So in this case, we believe it actually wasn't in an inn. It was actually in the grotto associated with the house where the animals would be feeding and also the food was being prepared because the house was full with visitors. So a little bit different concept. A lot of what we see is actually medieval people's concept of what it would be like in medieval times. Oops, I bumped it, sorry. We'll have to go forward again. Sorry about that. Thank you. All right. Also in Bethlehem, we have a Franciscan church, and you can see up here, Gloria in Excelsior Deo, across here. And they believed traditionally this was where the shepherds had their sheep and the angels appeared to them. And so here is the traditional church on this site. We don't know precisely where it was, but certainly in this area. What we do know, and this is very clear, that they get snow in this area in winter, which would be December. So quite clearly they weren't tending their flocks in December. So that's not the date when the announcement of the coming of the Messiah was given. Now we do know that when the when the wise men asked Herod, and Herod asked the scribes where the Christ, the Messiah, was going to be born, they told them Bethlehem. And we do know then that, and he said to them, when you find the Messiah, come and tell me. But the angel came to them, and Joseph and Mary and Jesus went and fled to Egypt. And we know then, of course, that Herod, when he heard that they'd given him the slip, he decreed that all the firstborn babies in that time were to be killed. It's a pretty terrible thing, but what we do know is that at that time, probably in Bethlehem, there were only about 400 people, and it was only the firstborn. So it probably wasn't a lot of children, but nevertheless, it was a terrible thing. And we know that instead of coming back and going to Bethlehem, the angel told them to go back to Nazareth. And so on the return from Egypt, they went to Nazareth. Now, we don't know precisely where they lived, but recent excavations have found some very ancient sites, and these are probably very typical of what their dwelling would have been like. So let's have a look at a typical village in Christ's time. As I said, mostly they would have a grotto, and here we can see a grotto with some sheep in them and the shepherd outside, and this has been established to give us some idea of what it was actually like in that time. Even to the vineyard. They've got a vineyard, and because it was hilly country, they're all terraced. And another interesting story that can be attached to that, but we won't divert there. And they've also made what typical carpenter's shop would be like in that era. What happened after this? Jesus grew up here, as we know. What was the next important event in the life of Christ? It was the baptism. It was at Bethany-beyond-Jordan. Once again, a traditional site. It may not be exactly, but it was certainly very near here. It is believed it's the same site where the Jews crossed over into the Promised Land, and nearby also where John the Baptist was baptizing. So this is the mighty Jordan. As you can see, it's not very wide. It is often less than 10 metres wide, usually around about 2 metres or less in depth, but it can flood, and then it can be 3 to 4 metres in height. What we're doing here, we're actually on the Jordanian side, looking across the border with what used to be Jordanian territory onto the west bank of the Jordan. A very popular site for people to come and be baptized, usually on this side. And here we are sitting, watching a very evangelical group being baptized in the Jordan River. As I said, it's a traditional site, but it's very, very clear that it would have been somewhere very close to here. So there have been many churches built. Oh, when you come up out of the riverbank, we're now looking across, and here is the modern-day city of Jordan. So that's why we know it must be very close to this area. And many churches have been built on this area. This is an Orthodox church. You can't see it, but over here there's a dome showing up of another church. I show that because it's a Russian Orthodox church, and Vladimir Putin came down for the opening of that. Also, when Pope John came down here and had a mass, he also commissioned a church which is being completed. And here are some of the churches that are around this area. There are also ruins of churches. All told, there are 24 churches all around this area. The next important event, as we know, was the temptation. And we read, Jesus was led by the Spirit into the desert to be tempted by the devil. And you can read the other text there as well. We don't know the precise area, but we do know that it's all desert around this area. And this is some of the, that's what the country's like. It's actually in a rain shadow, so it doesn't get more than 8 millimetres or 8 inches of rain in a year, if you're lucky. It's also believed this is where David fled from Saul. And there's lots of caves in this area You can see just a few here. I took this out of the bus window as we're driving. So how would you survive here? Well, there are areas where there is natural springs flowing down, and here's one of them here. And so people could live in these, and many people did, and they had an abundant water supply coming down. Now from here, after Jesus spent the time in the wilderness, he then went to Galilee. What do we know about Galilee? We're not told where Jesus was after the temptation, but we are told that after John the Baptist's death, that he went to Galilee and lived in Capernaum. Doesn't want to go. Thank you. So just a map to give you an idea of what it's like in the time of Jesus. Oh, I'm sorry. Batteries are flat. Only put new ones in the one. Good, thanks. So, thank you. So here we have, this is the West Bank, and this is the East, this is the, if I get it right, it looks north to south, but this is the West Bank, and this is the East Bank. And here is Capernaum, where Jesus spent most of his ministry. The distances here you can see are very small. So from Capernaum down to Magdala is a whole 15 kilometres. Over here is what we now know as the Golan Heights. And here are some other ones we'll be talking about. This is where the Beatitudes were given, approximately there. Gennesaret, Kursi, Gadara, and Tiberias. The widest point here is 13 kilometres and around about 20 kilometres north to south. The longest distance is here. I get confused because we're looking at it. It should be actually looking around the other way. So let's just have a look at some of the... This is looking on the West Bank across to the East Bank and what is known as the Golan Heights, which has been a critical site because the Syrians used to control this and would send rockets and everything over into the Israel side. But now Israel has this under its jurisdiction, and so we're able to travel around here. There was a drought a few years ago, about year 2000, I think it was, and they found this boat. And this boat is a first century boat. We don't know what the boat was like, the boats that were like that Jesus actually travelled in, but this is the type of boat that was around at that time. And they've now brought that up, and it's about 2.3 metres wide and about a bit over 8 metres long. A bit of a cockle shell, really. And you say, well, you know, it's a pretty calm-looking lake, but don't be deceived. These winds come roaring down from up here over the Golan Heights, and this can come very, very rough, very, very quickly. And I can understand a little cockle shell like this, that indeed you would be afraid for your life. So let's have a look at the Galilean ministry of Jesus. Just another site. Oh, and by the way, This is the mighty Jordan River as it leaves the Sea of Galilee. So it's not the kind of thing you think of as the mighty Jordan roar. We're actually out on the Sea of Galilee, and we're looking over to here, and this is where Capernaum used to be. We don't know a lot about Capernaum because they've only excavated a little bit of it. We do know or believe that it was the home of Peter, and it also at that time had a population of about 5,000. And as I said, they've built a synagogue there, a church there, a Franciscan monastery, which I won't bother showing you, but they've excavated a little bit, not very much, but just a little bit, and so here we have the excavations revealed a first century synagogue. So it would be very, very obvious that Jesus probably would have walked in here and preached in that synagogue. Because as was his custom on the Sabbath day, he went into the synagogue. And here are a few buildings that they've excavated. One of them is claimed to be where Peter was born. There's no proof of that, so I haven't bothered to emphasise that. But let's have a look now at some of the things that happened while Jesus was living in Capernaum. He healed the Capernaum official's son. He drove out an evil spirit from a man in a synagogue. It may have well been that synagogue. He healed Peter's mother-in-law. He healed a man lowered through the roof. He healed the centurion's son. He healed Jairus' daughter and a suffering woman. And this is where he called Matthew, and also where he discussed the bread of life. What else happened in the vicinity? Well, first of all, we know that he fed the multitude. We do know that he fed the 5,000. We've been reading about that in our Bible study lessons. And we don't know precisely where it was, but we believe it was somewhere around here. And we do know that when the disciples got in the boat to sail away, and a great storm came up and Jesus walked on the water and came to them, we do know that they did end up over here, and the Bible tells us at Gennesaret. So that's probably across there. I'm sorry, up here, across here. So what else happened in the area? We also know that the demoniac was healed, and we believe that the evidence is that it was probably here at Kersey. It's an interesting thing because you hear various descriptions made in the Bible about where it was. Some say it was in Decapolis. Decapolis is actually a very wide area. Decapolis just simply means 10 cities. And one of those, for example, was down here at Gadara. It could have been any of these 10 cities, and even Damascus is included in that Decapolis. So it depends what area they're talking about. In the region of Gadara, someone says here, but all the evidence indicates that it was probably more around this area where Jesus came and drove out the man possessed, drove out the devil. Another very important event that happened, of course, was the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes, and the indication is that it was somewhere around here. So there's a Franciscan monastery there, and let's just have a look at that. Now this is, once again, we're out on a boat, and you can see, if you look very clearly, or very closely, a building. That's actually the monastery up there. We don't know precisely, but it fits all the reasons why it would be somewhere around there. Just out of interest, these are coverings for the bananas they're ripening there. So let's go and have a look at the Franciscan monastery. I couldn't get a very good photo of it, but this is looking out through one of the arches, and this is looking from the Franciscan monastery across the Sea of Galilee to the Golan Heights. We think of the area as being very dry, but you saw how green it was, and it's because there's a permanent spring here. And I don't know if you can read this, but it says, I will give you, if anyone thirsts, come and I'll give you the living waters, and here are springs of waters. And also, this is where Jesus gave the Beatitudes. And so all along the path, there are these signs quoting the various scriptures. I unfortunately photographed one which wasn't the best example, but blessed are they who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied. A very modern excavation. They were going to build a resort there, and when they were doing the groundwork for it, they excavated a town which is Magdala. Once again, it wasn't until 2009 that we knew where Magdala was. As I said before, it's 15 kilometres from Capernaum. There we go. And here's a first century synagogue they unearthed. Once again, it's very likely that Jesus actually preached in this synagogue or worshipped in this synagogue. We know it was a synagogue also because there is a Minerva. You can see the Minerva. Oops. You can see the Minerva on here, which indicates it was a synagogue. And you can just see some of the original tiles in this first century synagogue. This is a very interesting slide because when they excavated, they labelled part of the path. Every stone was labelled and reconstructed here. So it's exactly as it was in the excavation, and they've made a chapel. And you can see some feet, sandaled feet here, because this is where Jesus would have walked. There's no doubt about that, because he would have walked these streets, and these are the original stones in their original place where Jesus walked, and we were able to walk there. Now let's move on, and from Magdala, I thought we should just mention one specific thing that is recorded, and we studied about that this morning. What would that have been, do you reckon? The Samaritan woman. And where did Jesus meet the Samaritan woman? At the well for water. And this fits all the criteria for being where the well was. And here we have an Orthodox church of the and inside here is the well. And you can actually, and here are a couple of the nuns from the Orthodox church just bringing up a bucket of water. And Jesus asked the Samaritan woman for a drink of water. And you remember she said, you're asking me for a drink of water. And Jesus went on to say that I will give you living water. But she said, how can you get the water? You don't have a bucket. And it's very deep. This is very deep. It's about 40 metres down, and it's believed to be the original well of Jacob. And so there's no other wells that fit that thing, that criteria. And you remember she also asked Jesus, where should we worship? Jerusalem or Mount Gerizim? And so I thought we'd just take a diversion here. Here are the remains of the temple on Mount Gerizim. This is a little chapel that's still in use. You can go down in here, but the rest is just the ruins they'd excavated. Now, why have I taken this picture? I've taken this from the top of Mount Gerizim, looking down, and this is a Samaritan village. There are only 800 Samaritans still surviving today. These were Assyrians which came down and established them. The king sent them down to establish where the Jews had been originally when they were taken captive. There are only 2 colonies. This is the major one, this group here. Don't get alarmed by this. This flash building is a millionaire's building. And the other little group is somewhere near Tel Aviv, but 800 in all. They use an old Hebrew writing, and they have their own distinct language. And at 800, they're very much in danger of becoming extinct. So let's move on and let's follow the latter period of Jesus' life. Jesus many times travelled Jerusalem to Jericho and Jericho to Jerusalem. He would have travelled here several times. And as we know from the story of the Good Samaritan, it was a very dangerous road. So this was a setting for the parable of the Good Samaritan. A challenging road as we found it, even downhill in 43 degrees Celsius. It was hot. And it drops from about 1,035 metres above sea level right down to Jericho, which is 260 metres below sea level, the lowest sea in the world. Now we know that Jesus travelled down this road to Zacchaeus', and you remember the story of Zacchaeus in the tree? And he asked him to come down and come into your place for tea. But it's also very important because, remember, Jesus was coming, well, if you read the biblical record, he was coming up from Jericho for his triumphal entry into Jerusalem before he went on trial and was crucified. And I don't know what time of the year that was, but uphill would be certainly a good walk. And as I've said, it was 43 degrees downhill for us, but coming uphill, whatever the temperature was, I think would be pretty daunting. So let's have a look. This is looking down into Wadi Quilt. Wadi Quilt is virtually a gully where when it floods, the water runs down. You can see along here, this is not a path. This is to catch the water and channel it all the way down so they can catch it down below. Here is the path that we actually trod. I show you this picture because the whole of this Wadi Quilt has caves. And this is where the bandits would live, in these caves, and also people who were recluses would live. So this is just to give you a picture of some of our group walking down this. We don't know if this is the precise route that Jesus walked. We do know it was this Wadi Quilt, but over the years there's been various tracks. But at least we know that down this Wadi Quilt, Jesus walked, and rode on the donkey probably too. And I'm reminded of a song And I don't know how many people know this song. As you travel along on the Jericho road, does the world seem all wrong and heavy your load? Just bring it to Christ, your sins all confess. On the Jericho road, your heart he will bless. On the Jericho road, there's room for just two. And you can see that very clearly in that slide. No more and no less, just Jesus and you. Each burden he'll bear, each sorrow he'll share. There's never a care, for Jesus is there. So, as we just mentioned, Jesus came up from Jericho for the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. This is one of the most recent excavations under the modern city of Jerusalem. And you can see it's supported by beams above so that it won't disturb the dwellings above. If you read the recent National Geographic, you'll find that the Palestinians who are living above that claim that it is disturbing their buildings, but that doesn't matter. But we do know that this is where Jesus walked, because this is the pathway, the original pathway, which leads from the Pool of Siloam up into the city. So I walked where Jesus walked when I went up those steps. We also know from this that it's probably where the priests came down to have the puritanical cleansing, and then they'd go back up to the priest's dwelling. And here you can see a continuation of the steps going up here to the high priest's palace. And the excavations indicate this is probably where where Jesus was brought to Caiaphas. When you go inside this excavation and where the church is now built, there's this hole right in the middle. And you say, well, what in the earth is that all about? Well, it's believed, we do know that the high priest would never come into the presence of a criminal because he would be contaminated. And so it's believed that Jesus would have been lowered down this hole, and Caiaphas would then question him above to find out what he had done to be worthy of judgment. And when he found that he was not a criminal and hadn't committed murder or any heinous crime, he would have been taken up and then taken down below to Caiaphas' chambers, and just a picture of those chambers. And this is where Jesus was judged. Up above, where the church is, there's this monument. Could you guess what that's all about? Sorry? Yes, exactly, Alex. So here's when the cock crows, and here he is denying that he knows Christ. How many times did he do that? 3 times. And then we do know that he was crucified. We don't know a precise place once again. There is a traditional church built on what they think is the place. But we do know he was buried in a tomb. Now, this one doesn't have the stone on it, but this is a traditional site, just to give you an idea what the tomb is like. And here inside is where the dead person would be laid. Now, there's nothing there. What distinguishes Christianity from any other faith? The resurrection. You can go to the site where all Buddhas, Muhammad, were born or died, but you can't go to the site where Jesus was buried. It's empty. There's no commemorative building there. But you know the story, just to refresh you with the story, they then came to the tomb after Jesus had rested when? In the plan of salvation, the most important event. He chose to interrupt that to keep the Sabbath. And after the Sabbath, they came to embalm him because they didn't get time to do it before the preparation for the Sabbath had come in. So they came to embalm him, and we know that the tomb was empty. The stone had been rolled back. And when the guards came and told the high priest and the rest of the synagogue the story, they bribed them. They said, "Tell them you're asleep." Now, that's punishable by death. If a soldier is on duty and goes to sleep and the prisoner escapes, in those days, the verdict was death. So they assured them, if you read the story, they will fix it all up and keep it quiet. We want you to say that while you slept, the disciples came and took the body away. This is one of the most compelling stories as far as Christianity is concerned. Many people like C.S. Lewis, it's this story that converted them. Just think back. Where were the disciples when Jesus was taken prisoner? Only Peter snuck up nearby and then denied him. And then after the crucifixion and burial, they all went their various ways. Disillusioned. They went back to their trade, completely disillusioned. Frightened that they would be identified as followers of Jesus. What made the difference? These disciples who died for the cause, what made the difference? The empty tomb. And that is what distinguishes Christianity from any other denomination. You don't put your life on the stake for a lie. If you know it's a lie, you take the body and claim it was risen. You don't then change from being a coward, not wanting to be identified with Jesus, to go to the ends of the world and preach the resurrection. So what converted them? The resurrection. And once again, I want to take you back to the Sea of Galilee. You've seen this picture before. Up here is where the Beatitudes were given. But I want you to come down here. It's not very clear. There's a church. This church is erected because it is believed that this is where Jesus came after the resurrection and appeared to the disciples, and particularly Peter. Here's the church. Now, we don't know if this is the precise place. Once again, it ticks the right boxes. Up here is a spring coming into here. It's a very good fishing spot. You can see some boats there now. It would have been a very likely spot where the disciples had gone back to their trade and were fishing. And this is believed. See, I'm pointing to it here. And tradition says that this is where Jesus came and prepared the fish and called the disciples. And what are we told? What did he say to Peter? Three times he asked Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me?" He says this three times. What was the significance of that? because 3 times Peter had denied him. So he says, 3 times, yes, Peter replies, and Jesus says, feed my lambs. Jesus asks the question again, and Peter says, you know I love you. And he says, take care of my sheep. And finally, Jesus asks him again, and you can picture the distress in Peter's voice as he says, Jesus says to him, feed my sheep. And Jesus' final injunction to Peter and to all disciples is, follow me. And we each one are challenged today, like all disciples, to follow him. But one final event that occurred was Jesus' ascension. Now, we don't know exactly where that was. Once again, there's a traditional site. All we're told is that Jesus left Jerusalem and walked towards Bethany. He lifted up his hands and blessed them and then ascended. And then we know, once again, Luke's description of this in Acts. 2 white-robed men said, the same Jesus shall come in the same way you have seen him go into heaven. As Adventists, this is the event that we are looking for. This is the event we should be working for. The Jews were looking for the first Advent. They lost it. They weren't ready. Even the disciples, when Jesus tried to explain to them his real mission, they didn't get it. And you know, I don't know about you, but one tends to want to be critical and say, well, how could they be so blind with all the evidence they had that this was the Messiah? How could they miss it? We're looking for the second Advent. Isn't it a possibility we could miss it too? We're critical of the Jews. We should be very conscious of current events. It's a wake-up call for each one of us. What did Jesus say? First of all, he gave the parable of the virgins. Who were the virgins? They were waiting for the second coming, weren't they? The bridegroom. How many were ready? We're told that if it were possible, that this coming event could deceive even the very elect. We're told we know not the hour. But the current events we see today should be a wake-up call for every one of us. Let's not be smug and complacent. We criticise the Jews, and yet we're told that we are in danger of missing this great event, the event which we as Adventists proclaiming because we believe sincerely that will happen. Let us each one examine ourselves and see where we stand, that we'll not be amongst those who miss out, just like the Jews missed out.